All right, now, as the nation prepares to vote, says the New Zealand Business Initiative yesterday, the sentiment across New Zealand is one of frustration and concern. Skyrocketing living costs, unaffordable housing, strained healthcare, and a growing educational gap are the voices of a country looking for change. Yesterday, in response to that, the New Zealand Initiative presented what they said is a well-researched answer to these challenges in its latest report, Prescription Prosperity, and one of the authors of that particular paper and the director of the New Zealand Initiative, Dr. Oliver Hartwich, joins us now. Oliver, thank you very much for holding on. How are you and how's it all going? Your perspective of the New Zealand Initiative at the moment?
Oh, we are firing on all cylinders, and we are really excited about this latest document, Prescription for Prosperity, because it is the culmination of 11 years of work. What we have done is actually we've gone back through our back catalogue, going back to 2012, when we started, and we had a look at all the recommendations, all the policy analysis we have undertaken over those last 11 years. And then we compiled all of this into this document, Prescription for Prosperity, as our alternative manifesto for this year's election. So here you've got a document that's actually based on at least 100 reports, plus a few hundred opinion pieces that we've produced over the years, distilled into one document, presented in 21 different categories, and it's a pretty comprehensive blueprint for change in New Zealand. And if we only got half of that implemented, you wouldn't recognize the country anymore. It would be so much better.
All right. The New Zealand Initiative, just remind us again, you're sort of the new version of what used to be the Business Roundtable, yeah?
We are a think tank. That means we produce research on all the issues that we think will matter for the long-term prosperity of this country. And we are a business membership organization. We are supported by some of the leading businesses in this country. And as I said, we have been operating since 2012.
Yeah, and you've also got some pretty hefty intellectual types working for you. I'm thinking particularly of Emeritus Professor Des Gorman. I think he was Auckland University Medical School. Murray Horn, former Secretary of the Treasury. And then you've got a whole series of PhDs, yourself, Dr. Eric Crampton, Dr. Bryce Wilkinson, Dr. Michael Johnston, Dr. Matthew Birchall. So there is a bit of intellectual...
Dr. James Kirsted, yes.
Yeah, but there's a bit of intellectual heft there, I have to say. I guess you're a sort of private sector treasury, are you? Would you think of yourself like that way?
I think we're better than the Treasury.
Of course you do. Well, you've got a previous Secretary of the Treasury working for you.
Yeah, when Treasury was still good. No, I mean, seriously, we have a very qualified team here in the office, and Dr. Eric Crampton, our chief economist, got his PhD from George Mason in the US. We have Dr. James Kirsted, who got his PhD from Stanford. We have Dr. Matthew Birchall, who got his PhD from Cambridge. I only got my PhD from Germany, so I'm still a little bit underqualified against all of these eminently qualified colleagues here. And of course, with Dr. Bryce Wilkinson, we also have one of New Zealand's most experienced economists in the office, who was involved already in the 1980s reforms, and he got his PhD from Canterbury. And is a living encyclopedia of everything economic policy in New Zealand. So no, our team is extremely well qualified, and we've been doing research, as I said, for more than a decade, and now we thought it was time to package it all up, bundle it, and publish it for the election this year.
Okay, that's fair enough. I'm sure you don't expect anyone to listen to you in terms of the political parties, because they will have released, I assume, most of their, or if not all of their policy yet. So what's your target market here really, Oliver?
Well, actually, you might be surprised, but the parties are listening to us, because what we did was actually, yesterday was the release of the document, but we've been in close consultation with the parties over the last few months and actually last few years. So none of the recommendations that we released yesterday would have come as a complete surprise to the parties. In fact, as I said, this is base research undertaken over more than a decade, and over that decade, of course, we've been in touch with the parties. So when you go through some of the parties' election manifestos, you will find quite a few of our ideas already there. So we don't have to start from scratch now convincing people of our ideas. You will see that many of these ideas have already had an influence on especially the opposition parties.
which leads to the next question. Have you found some political parties more receptive to your ideas than others?
Yes, of course, and partly that's in the nature of think tank work. So I found actually over my almost 20 years now in think tanks that it's always easier to work with the opposition of the day, because once you're in government, you've got the whole public service behind you. You don't need to listen to anyone, and frankly, after a while, you get arrogant and don't listen anyway. So what we do in think tank land is typically we work with the opposition because they don't have the luxury of having armies of political consultants behind them, and they're generally more receptive to ideas. And we found that in this case too. So when we're talking to National and ACT, they are very receptive to the ideas. And I think if you just go through some of the things that ACT and National have proposed now, especially in the fields of education, but also in the field of local government reform, of monetary policy resetting, you will find that some of the ideas have a parallel in our own Prescription for Prosperity report.
Okay, let's just take some of the big stuff first of all. You're looking particularly, shall we just take economic policy and fiscal policy in particular? I'm interested in your ideas on the Reserve Bank. The Reserve Bank Act has always been used, ever since Ruth Richardson was around, largely with one aegis and one aegis only, and no matter how brutal it should be, to control inflation. I think it was originally within a 0 to 2% band. Now I think it's 0 to 3. What are the problems that you see in the current monetary policy being used to control inflation through the Reserve Bank?
Well, you're right. Before the current government, we had stability in the settings for the Reserve Bank. There was one target and one target only for the Reserve Bank, and that was to keep inflation under control. And you're right. Initially, it was 0 to 2%. It's gone up to 1 to 3% over the years. But on top of that, of course, the current government also tasked the Reserve Bank with all sorts of other things. So first they told them, can you please look into housing affordability? Then they said, actually climate change might be another thing to consider. Then finally it was a specific mandate for unemployment. And so the Reserve Bank over the years got confused because it has way too many targets to consider. And so then we also got, of course, a Reserve Bank governor who was very receptive to all of this and loves doing politics. And so we think, actually, it's time to go back to the original setting because none of this has worked. I mean, we have inflation in this country well beyond the target, and we argue that the Reserve Bank lost sight of its original target, namely to keep prices stable. And so what we recommend in our document is to return to the settings that the Reserve Bank had prior to this current government, and also to return the inflation target where it originally was, namely between 0 and 2%. There are other things that we recommend. For example, we don't want to see deposit insurance implemented. And we also want to see a limit to the RBNZ's ability to purchase securities to government paper, so basically no more QE. So this is roughly what we're recommending for the Reserve Bank, because with that, we think we can get inflation back under control.
Right. You've also quite high up in your priorities, straight after economic policy, central and local government in your chapters. A particular bet noir of mine is the public sector, which I think has got out of control and is actually running this country.
Yes, I agree.
So can I just take you through, one of the things you've got down here is you want to repeal or amend the Public Service Act 2020. Now, I'm not aware of that act, and I'm an elected official, obviously. Right-sizing the public service, in other words, reducing its gargantuan appetite for taxpayers' money, and broader reform. Can you just take me through the Public Service Act of 2020 and why you want to repeal or amend it?
Well, we've had a Public Service Act, of course, for a very long time. That's always governed the operations of the public service in this country. But in 2020, towards the end of that first Labour government's term, we had changes to that act which emphasized the role of the Public Service and the Public Service Commissioner. So effectively, we have elevated the role of Peter Hughes, the Public Service Commissioner, to basically the link between Cabinet and the entirety of public service chief executives. So now we have effectively two kinds of Cabinet. We have a Cabinet of departmental chief executives, governed by Peter Hughes, and we've got Cabinet governed or run by the Prime Minister. And we think actually they put them kind of above the political representatives and above Parliament, where the public service shouldn't be. The public service should serve. I mean, the clue is in the name, right? And unfortunately, we've got it the other way around. We've got it almost in a yes minister style now, where the public service dictates to elected politicians their priorities. And then, of course, on top of that, we have seen a massive growth in public service from when Labour took over 47,000 people working there to more than 60,000 today. So we think all of this needs to be reformed. We need to make sure that a future government, a future reform-minded government especially, will be able to reform and won't have to work against the public service. Because, let's face it, the public service is a force of inertia. They never really want change, they want to do reform, they want to be kept in their ways, and they want to be kept in control. And we think it is high time to actually reform it so that a future reform-minded government can actually reform things like education. I mean, take education as the prime example of what I'm talking about. That is a ministry that 25 years ago employed about 300 or 400 people. It has since grown to 4,500 people. And they are so steeped in their ways. If we don't re-establish political control over the Ministry of Education, we will never change education in this country.
No, and I have to say the Ministry of Education now has become an ideological force in this country rather than an educational one. Well, that's my thinking. Do you have, what's your perception of that?
Yeah, I totally agree. We have seen very unhealthy ideology taking hold of New Zealand's education system, and that unfortunately was guided and orchestrated by the Ministry of Education, which has also grown, as I mentioned, ridiculously to about 4,500 people. So all of this needs to be reformed. We need to reform the public service, and then, of course, we need to reform the individual policy areas, and education is first among them, because in education policy, we've been going in the wrong direction for more than 2 decades. So we have been, I would say, misguided by the Ministry of Education on education policy, on pedagogy, on the curriculum, on the whole idea that students should lead their own education when in fact it should be teachers doing that. So there, I think, I see one of the greatest areas of reform need. And this takes, unsurprisingly, a large part in our manifesto, in our prescription. And in fact, if I go back over our publications over the last 11 years, I would estimate that about a third of them have dealt with education because it is such a big disaster zone.
Yeah, no, I agree. The other thing, though, it strikes me as you were talking was, and conflating or bringing together those two strands of the public sector and our educational policy deficiencies and the move towards ideology over empiricism. I guess I would be concerned, and I've seen it myself, with National in power. They talk a big talk until they get into office, Oliver. And then once you're in office, you end up being captured politically and personally by the same departments you're now charged of. So let's just take the Ministry of Education, for example. I always said this has happened to Anne Tolley. She was a classic example in my view. She wasn't a very bright person. Good God, I don't know how she's ended up Commissioner for, well, maybe I do know how she's ended up Commissioner for Tauranga. And she didn't have a particularly intellectual or educational background. And so therefore, whenever the ministerial advisors from the Ministry of Education walked into the room, they were always smarter than her, A, and then B, they had an agenda, and C, they controlled the information and data from which she supposedly made her independent opinions. Are you going to address that? Because what I'm worried about is that somebody who is good, like, for example, Erica Stanford, who presumably would become the Minister of Education in a new government, will end up being captured very quickly by the lack of independent policy advice and analysis available to her. Have you got an answer for that?
Well, there's always a danger that ministers will be captured by the bureaucracy. We've seen this many times. As for Erica Stanford, we've had dealings with her, we have discussed our education ideas with her, and I got to know her as someone who is quite steely in her determination, probably more so than your average politician. So if there's one politician where I'm hopeful that she will be able to take on the Ministry of Education, then it's her. But she will need help, because she will be one person against an army of 4,500 bureaucrats sitting in the ministry who've been doing the same kind of nonsense for the last 20 years. So she will have to reorganize this organization. She will have to take the ministry under her control, and she will have to ensure that she runs it and not the ministerial bureaucracy. One of the ways, for example, in which we could help ministers like her would be to actually take them out of the beehive. I think it's a mistake to put ministers all together in the beehive and then limit the direct interactions with their ministries to the half an hour or hour-long meeting every week with the department's chief executive. I would actually, if I were Prime Minister, I would tell my ministers to get out of the beehive, take an office in the ministry that you're supposed to run, so you're there on a daily basis and you see what's going on. And then just walk around the ministry and figure out what your 4,500 people do on a daily basis and show that you're present and that you care. And that way, I think we will re-establish political control over the public service. And that way, then ministers like Erica Stanford will be able to have an effect.
I prefer the direct route myself, Oliver. Just sack the chief executive. That message gets through pretty quickly, and then off you go. Appoint somebody that you like, you want. And if they come from, the New Zealand Business Initiative or the private sector, and they become the head of that department, whoop-de-doo.
That is one of the things that I have great sympathies for, and we cover this in the report as well. I mean, you can discuss how far you want to go. In America, in the US, of course, you fire basically the whole administration when there is a change of president, and then thousands of people will be replaced. You don't have to go to that extreme. You could also do what the Germans do, for example. So when a new government takes over, the minister is notionally in charge. The minister is the chief exec of the government, of the ministry. And then ministers can appoint a leadership team that's typically 10, 20 people. The rest actually stay, but the minister is in charge. Or you could do what the Australians do. Remember when Albanese became Prime Minister last year, he fired the head of DPMC and he installed a new Public Service Commissioner and a few other department secretaries in his first week. And it is totally normal practice in Australia that an incoming Prime Minister has the ability and the discretion to make these changes. I don't see any reason why we couldn't go at least as far as the Australian model in New Zealand to re-establish political primacy over the delivery of government services.
No, neither do I. I mean, it's crazy. I have to say, though, that I don't get the impression that the personality or political smarts of Chris Luxon is up to that. But that's just... Yeah.
Well, actually, let's talk about Chris Luxon then. I mean, Chris Luxon, whether he's got the political smarts or not, he has business experience. He was a chief executive. He's probably used to being the number one in a large bureaucracy, in a large organization like Air New Zealand and previously Unilever. So he would expect to be in a kind of CEO-like position as the Prime Minister. Under our current system, he would not be. Under our current system, even our Prime Minister is effectively some kind of chair. And we have to change that. We actually have to put the person in charge. And then I think, actually, this could well work to Chris Luxon's strength because he's used to being the CEO, giving orders and making sure that the organization actually works according to his directives. But that only works if we change the way the public service is structured.
Well, listen, I think that's the most critical thing. Before you start doing any policy, I think you need to change the way the public sector works and operates, because otherwise any other policy will simply be sabotaged, undermined, white-handed by those who are still in existence at the moment.
Totally correct. 100% agreement.
Gosh, that's pretty shocking, Oliver, that you and I here are just agreeing with each other. There must be something wrong with this. There must be some great evil that we've perpetrated between the two of us, mate.
Yeah, I would like to help you there. I mean, is there any other area in which we could disagree?
Well, that was the next one I was going to. Well, I wasn't going to disagree with you. I was looking at particularly at what you had to say about Mātauranga Māori. In your prescription, you say, in a recent refresh of the curriculum, the Ministry of Education signalled an intention to weave Mātauranga Māori, that is traditional Māori knowledge, into every learning area. Doing this with academic disciplinary subjects will create confusion for both those subjects and Mātauranga Māori. The ontological and epistemological characteristics of the knowledge base of most disciplinary subjects are incomparable with the knowledge base of Mātauranga Māori. Just on that issue, I mean, I totally agree with you. It was just crazy crap. I mean, that would be my analysis of it, but I'm a bit more direct. But having said that, that gives you some idea of the scale of the problem, doesn't it? I mean, they're going to have to say, they're going to have to give a directive straight away, day one, don't do this.
Correct. On day one, I would actually direct the ministry to stop work on this new curriculum, because the way they have been going is crazy. It is absolutely crazy to mix Mataranga Maori into every other subject area. That is not to say that Mataranga Maori has absolutely no place in the education system. I mean, of course it should, because it is part of the culture and the history of this country, so it should be taught. But we shouldn't do those. We should not mix it with other subject areas. Take the recent science curriculum debate. I mean, a science curriculum that doesn't include physics and chemistry and biology, that doesn't include mentions of atoms and molecules and compounds, or any other matters like that, but focuses heavily on Mataranga Maori, is not a science curriculum. Science is separate from Mataranga Maori. Again, no objection at all to Mataranga Maori being taught and mentioned and utilized at school, but simply not in science, because it isn't science. And similarly, I've actually seen, even in the existing curriculum documents, hints that, for example, Mataranga Maori and Maori, Te Reo Maori, should feature, for example, in foreign language teaching, other than Te Reo, of course. And that, again, strikes me as crazy. Or you look at the current guidelines in the Ministry of Education's documents for mathematics. So mathematics, you suddenly have things like ethnomathematics included, or mathematics for social justice, when people, as students, can't even calculate properly basic stuff. This is crazy. Similarly, for literacy teaching, you look at the ministry's documents there and you see that there is a great emphasis on social justice topics on Mataranga Maori once again, when in fact literacy should be really about teaching kids how to learn to read and write properly. So I think we have mixed too many things into one really undefinable mixture of or melange of knowledge areas, and that it's unhealthy. We should actually return to disciplinary knowledge and actually separate these things out quite neatly.
Oliver, thank you very much for joining us. Best of luck with trying to get this across the line in terms of the new government, but I can see, to be perfectly honest with you, one way that they could actually improve things would be to sort of embed some of your staff into some of those offices just quietly. Thank you very much. Look after yourself. Have a good weekend. That was Dr. Oliver Hartwich, Chief Executive of the New Zealand Initiative. You can read that report for yourself. It is, just go to NZ Initiative. There's a spelling test for you. nzinitiative.org.New Zealand. And you'll see their prescription prosperity, a briefing to the incoming government available.